Good morning. Welcome to Ordinary Life, an educational offering of St. Paul's United Methodist Church. I was thinking St. Paul's is really a very socially engaged organization. Tonight at 6:30 there will be an online Zoom Vesper service for the state of our nation. So attend that. Mm-hmm. And you will hear me mention in the talk today that I'm going to be part of a faculty here that is going to begin teaching the book of Ecclesiastes.
Right.
On Wednesday night.
Yeah.
A Bible study. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh.
We just got in trouble.
I didn't have my mic on. Do I need to repeat all that? No, probably not.
They'll get it.
So I was thinking also to encourage you to sign up for that. I found out that the last time they did one of these, 100 people were part of the class.
Oh, wow.
Big class.
And this will be online. Do you think I should take it?
Well,
or you'll just give me the cliff notes when we talk weekly.
I intend to copy the brief 2 or 3 pages that are in a book that Matt Russell gave me called God is Disappointed in You.
Yes, you've talked about that book.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, you've told me about it. Is it funny?
Oh, it's hilarious and
Yeah.
a little bit offensive.
Yeah, sure.
But this guy had a buddy of his, they were drinking beers in a bar one day, and the guy said he had never read the Bible.
Uh-huh.
And so the man who put God is Disappointed in You together agreed that he would write a synopsis of each book in the Bible, less than 2 or 3 pages.
Oh, that's great.
And give it to the guy. And it ended up being published with cartoons.
I love that.
In this book. And it's funny.
Yeah.
It's edgy.
Oh, that's my favorite. The Bible's a little edgy if you really get down to it.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
you take out all the thous and these and thous. I mean, it's edgy.
And Ecclesiastes did give inspiration for a song by the Byrds that was popular in the 60s.
Which we were just singing before this.
And people should be grateful that we're not singing it now.
Yeah.
So explore the St. Paul's website. Be aware of the service tonight at 6:30. To deal with the anguish that our country is in, we'll address that a little bit more today. Here's the plate.
Oh, I'll mention that. So we have such a generous class, and gosh, it just keeps reminding me that I keep forgetting to put the slide up to whom we have donated by the end of the year with very generous funds from Ordinary Life. Various nonprofits in the Houston area, some that we've donated to before, a couple of new ones, including a school in Kenya. And you can donate by clicking on the donate button on the Ordinary Life website. It'll take you to a form on the St. Paul's website, and you just write Ordinary Life in the memo. And we appreciate your continued support. And as I said, the money goes toward organizations who are working to empower those on the edges, those who are poor, homeless, just not able to make it during these times. So we're really, really, really grateful.
Do you want to say something about In Between?
Yeah. So we also have a podcast, and it comes out on Thursday mornings. We record sometime Tuesday or Wednesday. And it's our way of kind of preparing for the week, for keeping in touch with you guys during the week, being able to sort of stay in conversation. It's on our website as well under the podcast link, or on Apple Podcasts, wherever you download them. I have not yet put it on Spotify, and I know I sound like a broken record. I keep meaning to, I just forget. But join us. It's a fun way to connect, and occasionally we have guests, so that's been fun too.
Also, I will mention that St. Paul's is going to begin gathered worship next Sunday outside.
Oh, really?
Yep. So.
Is it reservation, or can anyone show up?
Well, there's a mixed message in that. I didn't check the website for this. I know that in other gatherings that we have done here, that they did ask for reservations. But if you don't make reservations, they're not going to kick you out. It's a church.
Yeah, that's true.
Welcome to all, you know.
Yeah.
So that's the message. So I brought these.
Mm-hmm.
This is in anticipation of when we together again.
Mm-hmm.
We used to quieten the crowd by doing this. People would settle down with their coffee and sacred cookies.
Maybe a while before we have
It may be a
cookie.
while, given what the
Mm-hmm.
new strain is.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you're welcome here and at any other part of St. Paul's that you would like to access. One of the ways to describe some of the gone wrongness of our country right now is that the people who are getting a lot of attention because of their behavior is that they are a combination of unaware and immature. So the other side of this coin that you see on the screen, awareness and maturity, are two of the major things that mark a living religion. Living religion is a phrase that I got from the works of Carl Jung, because he said that the solution to our difficulties was going to be found in looking into the answers provided by living religion. Now, Holly knows by now, and so does anyone who lives with me, like my bride, or if you've been attending these classes for long, you know that I like to know what's going to happen in the future. I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, and one of the things, according to Sandra Maitre, that marks a 7 is what she calls ego planning.
Mm-hmm.
So I have my menu planned for the next 7 days.
So you ego plan, I disaster plan. Is that how our
I
personalities?
do. You disaster plan? For
I
what's-
really don't, actually.
You don't?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
I think I've matured past that in my personality structure.
So over the years, I've done series of things. You know, I did a series on this, the Gospel of Jesus. This is one of 4 Gospels done by scholars over the years. Scholars. Thomas Jefferson did one. I don't think he was a scholar. He just had a pair of scissors. But there have been others who have done this. This is a good book to have in your library, by the way. You want an understanding of the Jesus narrative, easy to read, provocative, and it will give you the essence of the teaching of Jesus. And then I spent what was for some people an unbearably long time doing the Gospel of Thomas, but I love the Gospel of Thomas.
I loved your teaching on it. I realized that a lot of people gave you a lot of flack about it, but I think the Gospel of Thomas is a really beautiful set of scripture.
It is. And this is there are a number of books about the Gospel of Thomas that I recommend for commentary. So when the pandemic hit, and you know that it's still hitting us very, very hard here, and the prediction is it's going to get worse, I asked Holly if she would co-teach with me for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, month or so. Meanwhile, we're both getting grayer. Bill's getting balder.
I am.
Yeah.
I asked last night if I should shave my hair or get a wig, and Sherry said get a wig.
Oh, really? Maybe one of those like George Washington kinds with curls around.
Hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
It would be good. So I think you did this to humor me. I said I need a plan, and so we picked a plan. It took us about 2 months to kind of get our bearing.
Yeah, we did. We were kind of going topic by topic for a while.
For a while, we didn't know what was happening out there, and I didn't want to do that. So
I didn't do it to humor you, by the way.
Okay.
I really enjoy teaching with you.
So we started out saying that we were going to do the 4 Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and then we started in on the Sermon on the Mount. Teachings of Buddha and Jesus to guide us through the pandemic. So we're teaching with a view to taking the words of now from the Christian scripture and applying them to the circumstances that we are in right now.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while, we thought that was the pandemic.
Mm.
And then it became George Floyd.
Happened pretty early on. Yeah.
And now it's something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought how appropriate, how fitting was what we did last Sunday for the events of 1/6.
Mm-hmm.
And then this next long paragraph, 3 paragraphs in the Sermon on the Mount. It just fits amazingly. So I want to read it to you, and you can follow along. It's on the screen. I keep thinking, Holly, that I'm going to talk about the structure and construction of the Sermon on the Mount, but we run out of time.
Well, maybe we need to just make sure we dedicate some time to that because it's interesting.
And
Yeah.
I want to do that. Maybe next Sunday we can do that. Depending on what crisis develops in the country between now and then. So here's another old saying that deserves a second look. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. I think it was Gandhi that said, if you follow that, soon everybody will be blind.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to get us anywhere? Here's what I propose. Don't hit back at all. If someone strikes you, stand there and take it. If someone drags you into court and sues you for the shirt off your back, gift wrap your best cloak and make a present of it. And if someone takes unfair advantage of you, use the occasion to practice the servant life. No more tit-for-tat stuff. Live generously. You're familiar with the old written law. Love your friend and its unwritten companion. Hate your enemy. I'm challenging that. I'm telling you to love your enemies. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer. For then you're working out of your true selves. Martin Luther King's going to get reference there.
A lot, yeah.
Your God-created selves. This is what God does. He gives his best, the sun to warm, the rain to nourish, to everyone, regardless, the good and the bad, the nice and the nasty. If all you do is love the lovable, do you expect a bonus? Anybody can do that. If you simply say hello to those who greet you, do you expect a medal? Any run-of-the-mill sinner does that. In a word, what I'm saying is grow up. You're kingdom subjects now. You're kingdom subjects. Now live like it. Live out your God-created identity. Live generously and graciously toward others the way God lives toward you. This is such a rich passage. I was tempted to text you last night and say, let's do this one again.
We could.
So here's a mantra that you can use to begin your daily spiritual practice with. My intention is to wake up. My intention is to clean up. My intention is to grow up. I think one of the great disservices that white male folk religion has given people is the notion that all there is to authentic spirituality and religion is just making a decision for Jesus Christ, accept Jesus into your life, and that's the end of it. You don't have to think about this anymore. You got a ticket to heaven. And my theological response to that is horse feathers. Any religion that is worth its salt knows that real spiritual life is one that has written over the door, always we begin again. So I'm going to put a plug in here for your daily spiritual practice. People ask me what they can do, what that means, and I'm not going to go into that now, but I think that there are 2 books that you ought to read every year. One of them is the book, Always We Begin Again. Don't read it all at once. Just read a paragraph, a page, a day, until you finish it. Make notes about it. This is a very, 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 very helpful book in so many ways. you will be grateful that you read it. And the other book that I recommend is a book written by Jim Hollis, who used to be the director of the Jung Center here in Houston, called Living an Examined Life. You can read this book in 21 days, 21 chapters, about 10 minutes a chapter to read it. I'd read it and make notes. I'd reflect on it. I'd put it aside and then come back and read it again the next year. Anyway, we are going to try to do some honor to this very rich teaching in Matthew.
For sure. And I don't think it's a bad idea to stick to it another week. So we'll talk. But this is, this is where we are. And it is incredible how seamlessly some of the teachings that we've been exploring over the last almost 10 months have fit with what's been going on. So there's wisdom in old texts, and there's wisdom in making them new. We're living right now amidst ruptured social bonds, which Cornel West calls America's existential crisis. Regeneration through violence has been our way in America. I want to imagine, however, that there is a possibility that we can regenerate through restoration, similar to what South Africa undertook after apartheid fell. It was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'll get into that a little bit later. But what has happened and what is happening in our country is oriented toward keeping and maintaining the power that privileges white folks, particularly what Bill calls, or what you read as called white male folk religion. Who wrote that? The 12 lies that we need to undo. We always forget names right in the moment. Forgive us. What's your name again?
That's okay.
Okay. So I listened to a Princeton professor the other night give a talk at through the Rothko Chapel online. Professor Kianga Yamata Taylor. She talked about how the arc in this country, that there's the famous saying that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And she actually said, no, maybe the arc in this country does not bend towards justice, but toward different forms of racism and injustice that we have not dismantled yet. That was sobering. As much as I want to believe that things have gotten better, I don't know yet if they actually have. Yes, we live in a time when interracial marriage is legal. Yes, integration is legal. Yes, the civil rights movement happened and Jim Crow and slavery ended. Yes, we had our first black president, and now we celebrate our first female biracial vice president. But have we, as a society, ever truly committed ourselves to radical inclusion and equity? If we tell ourselves we have, we are believing a myth that is not only to the detriment of anyone who has been marginalized or treated unjustly, but we're also telling that myth to ourselves, and we're doing ourselves a disservice. If we had committed ourselves to it fully, societally, we would realize quite quickly that we have no need for enemies. To refer to MLK, or Martin Luther King, whose birthday is celebrated tomorrow, gradualism towards a just society is a hindrance towards progress. So if we keep saying, oh, we'll get there, oh, things have gotten so much better, in fact, the gradualism is illustrated when we say, but look at all the progress we've made. I heard a really wise speaker once say, the majority or dominant population in a society tends to look backward at history and say, look where we've come. But those who have been historically marginalized in a society tend to say, look how far we have to go. And I think that we, in order to create a just society, we need to go to the margins. We need to go outward. For true progress to occur, we need a soul awakening, not just a legal one that supports our highest ideals, but we need a radical reconstruction. This is the world that people like Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Jesus worked toward, a radically reconstructed world. We can have great laws, but if they are not implemented equally and justly, what do they mean? If we cannot lean into actually changing our hearts, learn not just to love our enemies, but really see them, really try to understand, then who are we as a society?
So the reason that people at the top tend to look back is because history is written by the winners.
Yep.
Except
The history we learn about.
the history that we learn about is written by the winners, except the prophetic tradition in the Jewish Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
The teachings of the Hebrew prophets and the teaching of Jesus come from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, much of organized Christianity has had a tendency to retranslate them as if they come from
Yep.
the top. But
What is it? We've empired Jesus.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What was the word that Jackie Lewis used?
That's what she said. We have empired Jesus.
Empired Jesus.
Yeah.
Commodified.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned Martin Luther King, because one of my colleagues here at St. Paul's, the Reverend Karen Richard Kwan, she does such wonderful work. I'm so grateful for Karen. She put together this faculty that I mentioned that's going to teach the book of Ecclesiastes starting this Wednesday. So if you go on your Life website, you can find that. And she sent out an email to the core faculty, those of us who are teaching, and had a link to a Martin Luther King sermon. And I was in one of those situations this week, meaning in a doctor's office, where I had time to read.
Okay.
And I read this sermon by Martin Luther King that was delivered in 1957
Yeah.
at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And did you know, I'm going to put a link to this in the thing, you probably knew this, there is a Martin Luther King Center for Study at Stanford University.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. So there's a whole database of this material that you can go back and listen. And this is just another example of entanglement, because the sermon that I read is based on this very passage of Scripture that we're looking at today. Love your enemy. And King, in the sermon, acknowledges a couple of things. One is, no, Jesus was not kidding.
Mm-hmm.
The definition of enemy for us is very, very different than it was in the time of Jesus. The people on the bottom had a lot of people on top of them who were considered their enemies. So Jesus wasn't kidding. And then King says, I acknowledge how very, very, very difficult it is to love your neighbor. So in this sermon, King said there were several things that are needed to learn to love your neighbor. The first is you begin by analyzing yourself. What is the how of this situation that we're in? How have we been complicit in creating our current existential crisis that Holly is describing? Why are these rioters so angry? Why do people believe so much weird stuff? And they are angry. They are angry enough to tear down the establishment. They want to overturn the election, primarily because many of them honestly believe that their election was stolen from them. So they feel justified in their anger. Never mind that that isn't true, but because they believe that, their anger is justified. I think one of the things that we need to learn is that feelings don't make facts. Truth is not dependent on how you feel. The second thing involved in loving the enemy, according to King, is to discover the element of good in your enemy. We are all a mixture of light and dark, all of us. Within the best of us, there is some evil, and within the worst of us, there is some good. A third way to love the enemy is this. If or when the opportunity presents itself to hurt your enemy, don't do it. Don't retaliate. By the way, Jesus did not say, like your enemy. He said, love your enemy. and those are two. Hate and retaliation only increase the amount of hate and retaliation in the universe, and further, it just distorts the personality of the hater. Somebody said that having a desire for revenge towards someone is like drinking a poison thinking that it will affect them. It hurts the one who does the hating. Now, with your permission, and I may be entirely without it, I'd like to give a smidgen of an application of these teachings by King to what we know from the current psychological, sociological data regarding the people who were the rioters in Washington on January the 6th. And I'm grateful to Andy Fuller, who is a distant Ordinary Life attendee, for sending me an article from the Scientific American that stimulated my thinking on this. It's one of the best things I've read to date about what's going on in the minds of those who were compelled, driven, led, followed, whatever the verb is, into the Capitol to do damage on January the 6th. So, and I'll put a link to this article as well in the summary that goes out Tuesday morning. There are a lot of reasons that we've come to this point in our society, and two pointed out by this article about why people have been attracted to this movement and what motivates them are called narcissistic symbiosis and shared psychosis. Now, big words, but let's define them. Narcissistic symbiosis, you can flip that a couple times to this one, next one. Yeah. Narcissistic symbiosis refers to the developmental wounds that make the leader-follower relationship magnetically attractive. The leader, hungry for adulation in order to compensate for some inner lack of self-worth or maybe organic disorder, projects grandiose omnipotence, while the followers, rendered needy by societal stress or developmental injury, yearns for this protective parental figure who's going to solve their problems and have all the answers. We'll come back and elaborate on the last part of what I just said before we're done today. Shared psychosis refers to the infectiousness of severe symptoms that go beyond ordinary group psychology. So when a highly symptomatic individual is placed in a position of authority, that person's pathologies and delusions can spread through a group, producing paranoia and violence, even in individuals who prior to such involvement seem perfectly normal. And you're hearing that now in that news story that I sent you about that real estate dealer from
near Dallas in Carrollton, Texas. Yeah.
I was just following the orders of my president.
Right.
But was posed outside the Capitol, having a picture of herself.
Rushing in the door.
Yeah.
And posed outside the Capitol with the peace fingers next to a broken window. That's an interesting one to look at all the way around.
So our society, and I've railed against this ever since I first heard about people wanting to cut teachers' pay and not raise minimum wage. Our society has created and is creating a larger and larger group of people who are experiencing socioeconomic deprivation and injustice of some sort. And two things happen to people in this group, likely. On the one hand, they sicken in one way or another. They become addicts, they get depressed, they commit suicide, they slip into criminal behavior, they become sick. All of which overburden the safety nets put in place to deal with such situations. And because the safety nets cannot contain them, the situation just gets worse. Or they become mad as hell and become candidates for the conditions that got us into the situation that we found ourselves in on January the 6th. So what can we do? Well, if we know that structural injustice, I'm going to call it structural violence, if you will, produces what we now have, we will work to create a more just and humane society, which is what Martin Luther King Jr. and what Jesus are talking about. That means we're going to work to reduce inequality in all of its forms. Economic, racial, gender, everything. Everybody has to have a place at the table. Now, perhaps the most frequent question I get regarding the situation that we're in is, what do I do if I have a family member or friend who's in this category?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, recognize that if their mind has been hijacked by this movement, it's not open to logic. So try to reason with them or to argue with them, you're only going to get pushed back like that. So don't try to confront. That only produces resistance. So if that doesn't work, you might try to change the circumstances that led to the faulty beliefs in the first place. There was a documentary that Sherry and I watched the other night. My son recommended it to us, called How My Father Was Brainwashed. And it's just a very personal example of what the social dilemma talks about how people who get caught up in social media and right-wing talk stuff come to believe it.
Yeah, one of my best friends is kind of going through that with her mother.
And we don't realize that, I don't care whether it's MSNBC, CNN, or Fox News, those people are out to monetize what they're selling, not to tell the truth. But they've got clever ads about it, you know, about what to do. And you have to protect your own mental health. So that if you feel that it's necessary, you set really firm boundaries, limit contact. You might even have to leave a relationship.
And boundaries also are a form of love. They can be a form of loving someone who is against you, because it tells that person where you stand. I think I like to call it fierce love. It's protective of the other and protective of the self. But as I read this bit of the Sermon on the Mount during this time, it challenged me. I'm not going to lie. There's a part of me that is tempted to forge ahead and kind of write off those who are not committed to creating a society that works for all people. I feel like enough is enough. And how many more times do we have to be faced with what Martin Luther King calls the fierce urgency of now before we get it right? I think logically I can get to the place where I realize that those who were rioting, who are committed to this sort of small way of seeing how they were compelled and called to storm the Capitol, they feel just as passionately about their cause as I might feel about mine. But emotionally and morally, I cannot okay their behaviors. So how, again, do we love the people who are against a kind of expansion? I'm disappointed in our fellow humans, and I'm saddened by the continued violence and an inability to learn from it. And this spreads over generations. This is not just in the last year. This is, again, the foundations upon which our country is founded. I want to get past the violence and the revenge. In the early 13th century, an enemy was defined as one hateful toward and intent on harming, an unfriend, from the Latin inimicus. And by that definition, those who stormed the Capitol last week and intended harm are enemies. How, then, do we love them? I turned to two different texts this week, and one of them was Strength to Love by Martin Luther King. It's a set of sermons, a book of sermons written by him over a number of years, in which the sermon that Karen sent you is contained. So I read 3 sermons. I read the one that Bill read. I read one called Love in Action, and then I read one called Love Your Enemies. I knew Martin Luther King would have something to say that could prove useful and wise. The other book I'm reading and has been on my list for my dissertation work is No Future Without Forgiveness by Desmond Tutu. These guys definitely knew something about being perceived as an enemy and about harm being done to them and how to forge ahead with love anyway. And as I wrote this last week, I was sitting at our dining room table, which has become the sort of ubiquitous study table, typing out some of my notes for this week. My kids asked Alexa to play King's famous speech, I Have a Dream. We'll listen to many snippets of that in the days to come, but will we hear it? So many of us have distilled that speech down to a few lines, the lines that say, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that one day little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers. That part of the speech is palatable and sweet, and so many of us have just made it about that. But his speech is actually much more radical and demanding of justice than those few lines. In it, he holds those who might be called enemies, intent on doing harm, accountable. He calls on his people, my people, he says, not to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred, to conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. And later, he quotes scripture and saying, we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. He calls for the people to love the enemy while also working for justice. So love and accountability are going hand in hand. And I would say working for justice for the most people is a form of loving the enemy because it creates a society that is inevitably better for them too. Who were Martin Luther King's enemies? They were white segregationists and, dare I say, white moderates who, as he put it, are more devoted to order than to justice, who prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. This in-between, if you will, it's struggle. It's hard. It's awkward and demanding, and it requires change, not just of our systems, but of our beliefs and behaviors. And many of the words that Martin Luther King wrote in the 50s and 60s are still so relevant. It's telling that we haven't yet achieved not just the dream that he had for America, that his fellow civil rights activists tried to forge. We don't have the dream that Jesus had for a new and just society either, which is why we still talk about things like the Sermon on the Mount. We'd have a new text if we were there, right? Mm-hmm. But we're not there yet. I don't know that any part of the world is. It's not just America, but this is the context in which we live and the one to which we can speak. I got off for a second. But Martin Luther King loves his enemies in part by speaking the truth. The dream he has is something to reach for, like the carrot to behold, once the demands of justice have been made. He doesn't say the white people in America need to die for what they have done to black folks in America. He doesn't even say white folks need to pay for it. He says we need to speak to it, speak to the history, and own the participation in healing it. The healing takes all of us. And we cannot gloss over the demands of justice and shoot straight for the dream. We would call that a spiritual bypass. So if I compare that to an argument with my spouse, if I try to move straight toward being nice without resolving the issue, my niceness isn't genuine or believed. So we must, in a word, grow up. So what can a grown-up love look like? The other text I turned to, as I said, was Desmond Tutu. And it looks like we look the beast in the eye and tell the truth about who we are and what we see there. He wrote, "Unless we look the beast in the eye, we find it has an uncanny habit of returning to hold us hostage." So if we can't look honestly at our present and how the past has influenced our present, we also cannot heal it. It's not so much that we have cultural amnesia. I don't think we've forgotten that our history includes slavery, genocide, sexism, mass incarceration. I think we just don't want to deal with it. I think we don't know how. And we, and by we, I am assuming mostly those who identify as white Americans, are in denial of the impact of our untransformed history has on the present. We haven't yet looked it in the eye. What do you say? Mm-hmm. That we don't transform, we transmit. Mm-hmm. But I wonder what it could look like if we borrowed this ethos of sawubona. This is an African adage. It's a greeting that folks say that means, I see you. So you would greet someone by saying, sawubona, I see you. And the other person says, I see you too. And then there's Ubuntu, which was the underlying philosophy that guided the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa.
This is a fabulous photograph.
It has a neat story to it. It's about a game being played. There was a whole story to it. I just thought, wow, that's beautiful. The feet creating a circle around which everyone is included. And they're all holding the circle. So these children are holding this circle in space. But Ubuntu doesn't have a direct translation in English. We do not have an equivalent word. So that alone makes me a little bit sad. I have to use a lot of words to describe to you what it is. With Ubuntu, says Desmond Tutu, you are generous, you are hospitable, you are friendly and caring and compassionate. You share what you have. It is to say, my humanity is caught up. It is inextricably bound up with yours. We belong in a complete bundle of life, and we say a person is a person through other persons. I want to repeat that. A person is a person through other persons. It is not, as Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. It says, I am human because I belong. I participate and share my humanity. A person who practices Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed, or treated as if they are less than human. It is to believe what dehumanizes you inexorably dehumanizes me. And as this picture says, I am because we are. It is, in short, a philosophy of interbeing, the same philosophy that guided the Buddha, that guided Jesus, that guided Thich Nhat Hanh, and many others who have sought peace in their life's work. All of that in a single word, Ubuntu. Martin Luther King, I believe, knew Ubuntu and believed in it fervently. And he and Jesus and thankfully others knew and led by this example that our destiny is bound up, that we are part of a single garment. We might, for the purposes of this teaching, say that love and forgiveness are inextricably linked. Loving the enemy is not sentimental. It is not a kind of like, oh, I love chocolate. It is, you mentioned earlier that Martin Luther King wrote, it's not even the same as like, right, which requires a kind of mutuality. Mm-hmm. Love is bigger than us. It is bigger than my feelings toward you and yours toward me. It's, I would say, in the in-between.
I think that the thing that Martin Luther King meant and the thing that Jesus meant, the thing that the Hebrew prophets meant, mm-hmm, is that they believed in the redemptive mm-hmm power of love.
Right.
Of love.
Yeah.
Not liking, but loving.
Right. And inevitably, to be the best form of love, we have to go outside of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, where this idea of God comes in. You know, how we have to see the world beyond ourselves mm-hmm in order to participate in love. You know, even one of the greatest minds of the last 100 years, now a little bit more, Einstein, a scientist who gave us relativity, who gave us infinity, who gave us expansion, who gave us so many different quantum theories, said, when it comes down to it, the universal force is love. Love is light that enlightens those who give and receive it. Love is gravity because it makes some people feel attracted toward others. And love is power because it multiplies the best we have and allows humanity not to be extinguished in their blind selfishness. So probably, I'm going to take a guess here, love is probably the one thing that Einstein couldn't explain, but he knew it existed.
When I was in seminary, one of the theologians who was really, really popular, head of a movement called Neo-Orthodoxy, was a German theologian by the name of Karl Barth. Mm-hmm. And Barth came to the United States to speak at the University of Chicago. And somebody asked him if he could, he went after the lecture, he went to a bar and had a beer with the students. A great story. Really offended the Southern Baptists that he did.
You don't drink beer with students, right?
He went to beer with the students. And some reporter asked Bart, said, so can you sum up your theology? And he thought for a minute, he said, Jesus loves me, this I know. And I thought then, and I think now, it is the appropriation of that love that has saved our African-American brothers and sisters. They got it.
The liberation piece.
The liberation piece.
Yeah, not the city on a hill piece.
Right, the liberation piece.
Absolutely.
They got.
Yeah.
And capitalized on it, you know, in a wonderful way.
The ethos of community, I think, is very strong in communities that have experienced marginalization, because the reliance upon one another for joy is huge, I think. So, you know, I do actually believe that all people are capable of love somewhere in them. Some of us get farther away from that little spark, and some of us grow it. And it is something that, let me say it, through a daily spiritual practice, can be cultivated, expanded, and practiced. Many of us stumble in and out of acting from love. Some days I'm in good form. Other days, ask my kids, I'm not in great form. It is rarely a straight line. And if some part of me is hanging on to hatred and resentment, I am dehumanizing myself as well as the other. So forgiveness, this is Desmond Tutu's theory on forgiveness, is a form of self-interest that increases my own personhood and does not allow me to wallow in anger and hatred. And King said that love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. And in one of his sermons, I don't remember if this was the one that you read or if this was further in the book, Strength to Love, he writes about the 3 different kinds of love. He said, the kind of love I mean here is not eros, which is an aesthetic or romantic love. It is not philia, which is a reciprocal, intimate love. It is agape, the love of God operating in the human heart. In other words, the thing that is bigger than us, that can help us to be better. How can we evolve then in both MLK and Jesus' words in a way that fit into today's context? One of my criticisms of the way we have interpreted King is that much of the work of forgiveness and love fell on the shoulders of Black folks. White society did not take responsibility for its actions or inactions on the whole. We changed laws, but did we change our hearts as a society? Forgiveness, agape love, these are heart changes. I watch the way white supremacy still rears its ugly head in our society and in our systems, even at the highest levels of government. And I feel despair.
So, again, I'm really ooching in the direction of thinking we might return to this very passage again next week. Because I do want to say some things about the structure of the Sermon on the Mount and the origins of it and its original intent and how we use it. There is a biblical scholar by the name of Walter Wink, who has really helped me understand so much biblical teachings more correctly, I might put it. You've heard the phrase, the principalities and the powers that Paul talks about, and principalities and the powers are going to get you. Those are not some things in the sky, demons. What the principalities and powers meant to Paul, according to Walter Wink, is the system. The system. You can't beat the system.
Yeah. And yet we make up the system.
It's a paradox.
Yep.
And by the way, what you said about this kind of enlightened self-interest, we do this ultimately to benefit ourselves. I mean, Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama had this huge conversation that was recorded in a book called The Book of Joy. And they keep saying that over and over and over.
Yeah.
Loving your neighbor is in your best interest, eventually. Otherwise, you keep getting January 6th over and over, or George Floyd, or whatever, over and over. So Walter Wink wrote these words. He said, "I'm puzzled that a species that has subjected virtually the entire universe to its analytical gaze and that has penetrated to the tiniest constituents of matter still knows next to nothing about how to become human." So the words in the Sermon on the Mount weren't written for us. They were not written with us in mind, but we can make them applicable to us.
Sorry.
The teachings of turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, give the shirt off your back, were intended to be used by powerless people to express power in a non-violent manner. Jesus was, in his time and in his worldview, taking people's usual way of dealing with life and turning it upside down. So someone in a position of authority, like a master to a slave, could and would slap a person if they didn't like what the slave was doing. The slap would be administered by the right hand, back of the hand, like that. And Jesus said, when that happens, turn the other cheek. So then the person in authority would be required to slap with the left hand, which was a hand that was not intended to touch another person. So if they did that, they would become unclean. Cleanliness and inclusion were a huge part of that particular society. To give somebody not only your cloak, but also the next garment would have made the person in the audience that Jesus was speaking to naked. And this too would have produced uncleanliness into the equation, because if you look upon on a naked person, that was to commit an unclean act. A person in authority, like somebody in the military, and there were many, many of these people in the time of Jesus, and they were in the group considered the enemy, by the way. They could and did order people at the bottom to do all sorts of things for them, and one of them was, here, carry this burden for me. And the law prohibited the soldier from, prohibited anything being carried more than a mile. So that if you did carry something more than a mile, that put you in charge. As you were the person in authority. Now you were making the rules, and that disempowered the other person. Very, very clever way of getting power. You might remember the scene in the crucifixion story where soldiers asked Simon to carry the cross of Jesus. That was just this very thing happening. So Jesus was deconstructing the way things had always been thought about and putting something else in place. The lesson or the opportunity for us here is that we have to deconstruct what has been inhibiting a more mature faith and recognize that to live through that destabilization is okay. Deconstruction is very destabilizing for a lot of people. So I want to go back to what Carl Jung said about a living religion. A living religion is one that's going to solve our problems if we can step into it and let it embrace us. And my definition of a mature faith is one that will teach us how to live without certainty and yet not be paralyzed by fear. Now, I want to give you some good news in the midst of all this bad news that's coming out, in spite of what you see in the newspaper. There are millions of people on this planet who are following this path. They are not in a lot of churches. They're in some, but they're particularly the evangelical movement that supported our current president does not allow for this. But you see this movement in something like the Ordinary Life class. You see it in a number of places in St. Paul's where there is this openness and inclusivity, plus socially engaged religion, dealing with the homeless and the poor, the racial issues. Check out the St. Paul's anti-racism page on the St. Paul's website, and you'll see encouraging things there. But there is a spiritual revolution happening in this country, and it involves doing exactly what Holly and I are trying to do right now, exploring what it means to have a mature faith. And of course, it also means exploring what's been inhibiting us from having a mature faith. So I think that one of the places that we could start is by admitting that the religion of our culture, consumerism, has us exactly where it wants us.
Sure.
We are passive. We are compliant. We don't think too deeply. We don't ask too many questions. We don't have a lot of conversations from the heart. We talk about the weather.
Well, it's as you have said, so many come into your office and say, I want things to change, but I don't want to change.
Right.
Yeah. And we are required to change. And that is, and it's inevitable. It's also beautiful when we do change because we get to be embraced by the fullness of our full selves.
Well, just keep in mind that we are, as a culture, in grips of white male folk religion. We're in the grips of patriarchy. And patriarchy is first and foremost about power. It's not about intelligence. It's not about skill. And the power in patriarchy is power over. And a big part of our current dilemma is that we have not yet mustered the creativity and the cultural consensus to create life-enhancing ways of relating not only to one another, but to life itself. And that's what I think today's passage is all about for us in the right here, right now.
One of the sermons that was in Strength to Love also talked about the most radical prayer that Jesus ever said, which was, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." I would venture to say that may also be one of the most grief-filled prayers that Jesus ever spoke. There's both a radical love in that, and there's also grief. Forgive them, they know not what they do. And there are a lot of spiritually blind people in society. I'm positive I've acted in blindness. But forgiveness helps us to accept this blindness, this sort of spiritual youthfulness, if you will. And it allows us to move forward and grow up. When we learn to love our enemy, we need a kind of love that is both forgiving and accountable. And what I think we need from our perceived enemies is accountability. This is a creative kind of love, a fierce love. And this transforms societies and individuals. What Martin Luther King wrote is that what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. As I read parts of Bishop Tutu's book this week, the no future without forgiveness. And I read about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how that came about. I began to sort of feel like, gosh, have we missed the boat on that, on something like that as a country? When apartheid fell, the TRC was assembled and pretty swiftly implemented. Apartheid ended officially in 1990, and the TRC commenced a couple of years later and really fully began in 1995. They oversaw restorative justice initiatives for 7 years. And at no point in our history have we successfully carried out any measure of kind of collective restoration. And I want to say a quick word about restoration is that both parties have to be willing. It doesn't work if the perceived enemy and the victim or vice versa is not willing. We cannot force restoration. This is a collective agreement. And the way that they agreed to do it was that those who had been victimized or oppressed would get to tell their stories publicly if chosen. And that those who had been the oppressors, the murderers in some cases, in order to receive amnesty of any kind, they had to tell their stories. They had to confess. If not, they could be persecuted and jailed. It took time, 7 years. And my guess is that that real work, this work of rebuilding a society in which there is togetherness. So this third way that was a kind of public storytelling, really people reported feeling a relief, a sense of ease, a sense of freedom by telling the stories, those who were victimized and those who were the oppressors. Both parties had been imprisoned by their trauma and their crimes. Both parties widely reported experiencing relief and freedom upon the telling. It wasn't perfect, but I think there was this willingness to see, to hear, to love, and to forgive. We're far more than 5 years out from some of the worst crimes in our collective history. Several generations have come and gone. But this is the question I'd like for us to entertain just as we sort of sit with this today. If I believe that loving our enemies has to do with restoration, what could that look like today? This is a genuine inquiry. I do not have all the answers, though I have some ideas. I truly mean for us to sit with the question and hold it kind of gingerly in our hearts and minds. How can we love those who have wronged us and those we have wronged in an accountable but restorative way? What does it look like for you, for your community, for this class, and for this church? I want to remember Ubuntu. I am because we are. And to close, I'll read the last verse of one of Richard Blanco's poems called The Declaration of Interdependence from his book, How to Love a Country. It's a beautiful book of poetry. And he framed this poem around lines of the Constitution. The last stanza is as follows. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We're the cure for hatred caused by despair. We're the good morning of a bus driver who remembers our name. The tattooed man who gives up his seat on the subway. We're every door held open with a smile when we look into each other's eyes, the way we behold the moon. We're the moon. We're the promise of one people, one breath, declaring to one another, I see you, I need you, I am you.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I don't know that book of poems.
It's a good one.
So maybe we'll come back and do this. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount is dismissed by a lot of people as being utopian idealism.
Mm-hmm. It's reconstructive.
It's reconstructive, and I think that one of the things that I came away from studying it this week, and why I'm so indebted to Martin Luther King Jr. for his sermon that was preached a long time ago, mm-hmm. is that he said two things. Jesus wasn't kidding. And this is hard.
And this is hard.
So no matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this, you carry precious cargo, so watch your step, and we will see you here next Sunday. Thank you, Holly.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.